Hey everybody, Charles from Gmat Ninja here. Welcome to our high-powered panel of 5 Gmat CEOs. Here to talk about, has the Gmat changed over the last 5 or 10 years? Has it gotten easier? Has it gotten harder? Is it being used differently? I'm going to introduce everybody real quick, and then if you have questions and you're watching us live, please fire away in the comments and we'll get to as many questions as we can. So we have Bhavin, CEO of Magoosh, Scott from Target Test Prep, Rajat from eGmat, and Stacy from Manhattan Prep. So I'm going to start with the title of the panel. So has the Gmat changed? Is the Gmat getting easier or harder? Has anything changed fundamentally with the exam in the last 5 or 10 years? And I'm going to let's pick on Rajat first. So what do you think?
Well, thank you, Charles. First of all, I want to thank Gmat Club for getting all of us together. We've been in the industry for, I think, upwards of a decade, and we've never been on a panel together. So this is good. So I think it's going back to, has the Gmat changed? I think the fundamental purpose of the Gmat hasn't changed. When you think about it, it's still there as a test to evaluate prospect test takers or admits readiness to get into a business school. And from that standpoint, the Gmat is, I think, in my opinion, it's more or less 90% still the same. I always like to put a number to it. There are some changes with regards to the fact that you now have the IR section there. Idioms kind of have been de-emphasized, but they were done in 2011, 2012 timeframe or so. But I mean, over the last decade or so, in my opinion, it hasn't changed a whole lot. I don't know what others have to say, Stacy, Bhavin, or Scott.
I agree with you.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the test has been pretty stable over a long period of time, and especially for practical purposes, anybody watching this on video, anyone preparing for the test today, that definitely falls under that category. I mean, you're right. I mean, that the idioms kind of phased out by and large, and maybe in the verbal section, more of a push towards meaning and logic and reasoning, as you alluded to, Rajat. But other than that, yeah, I think a Q49 is probably about as difficult to get today as it was a decade ago, or any other verbal score or quant score. So yeah, I think the test I agree, it's been very stable in terms of the difficulty.
Well, do you guys think that anything's changed in terms of how you prepare students? Is there something about the pool of applicants you're getting now? Are you telling them different things? I think everybody here has been in the industry for, I think we're all at least a decade, maybe a couple decades now. Has anything changed in terms of what you tell students versus a decade ago? But then I'll pick on you since I haven't heard from you yet.
Yeah. In terms of preparing for the test, I'd say not really. I mean, like, the test's been stable. So in terms of how to prepare for the test, I would say mostly the same. I think the more fundamental difference is, do you need to take the test? Years ago, the answer was 100% yes across the board, whereas now, I think many of us would recommend taking the test, but there's always cases, and you look more individualized of, do you get a waiver? Do you take the GRE instead? Do you look at, there's the broader question of, should I even go to business school, which I think even now is a more complicated question than it was many years ago. So I would say, in terms of how to prepare, no, but in terms of whether or not to take the test, yes, that's definitely changed.
Any other thoughts on, so Scott, Stacy, Rajat, as far as like when you get a student who comes in, they're not sure which test to take, has that advice changed versus 10 years ago? GRE was still a thing. It was accepted in admissions a decade ago. It's become bigger now. Are you guiding students differently in terms of that question of which test to go after, or whether to go after a test at all?
Compared to 10 years ago, certainly, because the GRE was still like, well, take the GMAT unless you think you can't get the score. Now all schools accept the GRE. The GRE is mainstream. It's as accepted as the GMAT, and so that isn't the question as much. Although I do think that attitude is still probably the same attitude. I don't get very many people trying the GRE first and then like, oh, this isn't working, I'll switch to the GMAT. It's usually the other way around.
And I want to kind of go back to how we prepare for the test. I think we know way more about the test now than what we did a decade back. I mean, there was no ESR a decade back. So that just the introduction of the ESR in 2014, and then the time period from 2014 to 2018 when the GMAT prep tests had the ESR built in them, allowed us to just do way more experiments and to understand the test a lot more. So I think the way you prepare, it's gotten a lot more personalized, and we can talk about how test prep changed that way. But I mean, fundamentally, you still need the same skills, but individually, how you personalize that instruction and really say, hey, this is what you need to learn, and this is what you don't need to learn, given what you already know. That has changed considerably.
Yeah. Yeah. And even to piggyback on Rajat said, we do know a lot more about the test today. And I really like that because, at least in my mind, there's so many great options out there today that a lot of it comes down to how hard are you willing to work, right? Whereas maybe 10 years ago, he didn't have these options for preparation, right? So today, I feel like it's wonderful because people who are willing to put in the work certainly have the resources to put that work in, and everyone's working smart, I feel. So it's coming back to, who's willing to put in the sweat equity and the time, and sort of, obviously it's a struggle for people. You have ups and downs and, along the way, but people who are willing to demonstrate grit and perseverance and a growth mindset, the GMAT certainly rewards those folks by and large.
Just to piggyback on those two ideas, so Rajat mentioning, because I think you have a really good point that we understand the test so much better than we did 10 or 15 years ago. I think it's 100% true. Kind of alongside that, we've had sort of, the way you can deliver test prep has changed enormously. And a lot of you have pioneered chunks of it, right? So some of these on-demand systems, I mean, you've built some of the best ones in the industry, right? That wasn't something that was possible 20 years ago. And I guess I'd love to hear really from all of you, because you've all been involved in various on-demand systems that are available now at a low cost. So what are those insights that we've gotten into the GMAT over the last 10, 15 years that have made that possible? And when you think about that, so again, 15 years ago, it was you hire a tutor, you take a class, all the classes were kind of the same structure back then. There were maybe 4 or 5 classes available. They were all kind of identical. That was it. Or you sat down with a book, a physical book. Those were your prep options 15 years ago. Now you've got this multitude of options. So kind of this deeper knowledge of the test, can you say a little bit more about kind of how that's informed the development of these different systems? And if you're somebody watching this and trying to figure out how to prep, how do you think about choosing in this world where we have all these options that we just didn't have 15 years ago?
At least the target test prep TTP is, we've had 14 years. A lot of this is time on the water, literally just putting these ideas into place, and the things that don't work, leave very quickly. The things that resonate with students and work well, stick around. So at least for our company, we've had this beautiful sort of evolution of ideas and ways of delivering content. What content is there? What content, more importantly, is not in there, right? Which algorithms work, which don't work, right? So we've had time on the water to assimilate this knowledge. And as Stacy, Bhavan, Rajat, Charles, you all agree, it's not easy to do this well. In fact, it's very challenging to do this well. It's time consuming, it's expensive to put together a product that really helps students. It's not easy. So that time factor has been a beautiful thing for us. Even if we had all that knowledge and we only had a year, we probably would not have been able to get it out there to folks. But just having the time on the water of putting this all together, I think has helped us significantly.
And Rajat?
Yeah, so I think 2 things. One is the two fundamental inputs into this. How has test prep changed? One is the knowledge of the test. The second is how technology has evolved and has allowed us to do things at a much lower cost than what was possible a decade back. So we know a lot more about the test. We know, you have those 3 abilities on the verbal side, 2 on the quant side. Again, you have those fundamental skills there. And when you collect, 4,000 or 5,000 ESRs or do simulations, you can deduce things from this. And that allows you to, for example, figure out, okay, a personalized study plan for every individual. So if you think about learning architectures fundamentally that exist in the world, they're just 2 fundamental learning architectures. One was what we call as a traditional book-based, same for everyone learning architecture that exists. And the second is more of a private tutoring base. And as a private tutor, when you work with a student, you're constantly absorbing information from that particular student and adapting your instruction to it. And one of our visions has always been to really say, okay, how can we go more and more towards that private tutoring-based architecture from just delivering the same instruction to everyone? And so with the knowledge about the test combined with what technology has allowed us, starting with, we can do stuff such as personalized study plans, tracking people's progress and giving them feedback every 20 to 30 minutes to really say, hey, verb ing modifiers, did you do that? How did you do it compared to, for example, someone who aims to get a 90th percentile and has gotten a 90th percentile in the last couple of years or so? Do you need to go back revise that also. We can institute precision there. We can institute good habits more and more with regards to technology. We can also tell people these are things you don't need to worry about because, maybe you don't need to do probability because your target score is Q48 and you're not worried about a Q51 because you're really good in verbals over your target GMAT score. So focus on areas that will give you the most bang for your buck given your target GMAT score. Those things, 5 years ago or 7 years ago, I couldn't even dream of, just to be very clear. And now all of those are possible just because of what we know about the test and what we know technology can deliver.
Bipin?
Yeah, I'll add, going back to what Scott said about just sort of, you referenced this time on the water. The amount of time that we've had to sort of build our systems, build our content, the number of students we see has really helped us sort of improve content quality, improve the way we write questions. When I think about when I was studying and I picked up a book, brand to be, stay nameless, but I picked up a book and I used it, and the questions were not representative of the questions when I took an official sort of MBA.com test and when I actually took the GMAT. And the realization now, having been in the industry for so long, is, well, it's really difficult to write a GMAT question that represents the actual test. We're not, able to use official questions, so we all have to write our own, and it's a complicated sort of challenge. But being able to see through technology, not through books, how people respond, what the item discrimination looks like, is this a good question? Is it actually achieving sort of the goal of sort of segmenting the population in the way that the GMAT wants to, sort of scoring on that curve? It lets us say, this is a bad question. We're going to pull it out of our question bank. We're going to add this question in. We're going to write these questions differently, better. And so it's really improved all of our abilities, not just Magoosh, but Target, GMAT, Manhattan, GMAT, across the board to write good questions. And then on top of that, the personalization, we can actually see what people are responding. We can see how that could impact their score. And yes, if someone's missing out on probability, but they're missing out on other more common subjects, question types, then we'll probably have them focus there rather than something that's maybe shown a handful of times and might not materially move the score. So that personalization combined with our ability to create content has dramatically improved the way we can help students improve. And I think when it goes to like how to choose or which provider, it's similar to a tutor in that just for different people, different things are going to work. And I think, we've all created products that we're proud of that many students have used, thousands, tens of thousands. But ultimately, it's really for students to sort of figure out, well, what works for me, what works for people sort of like me. And then there's lots of reviews out there, there's trials, there's all sorts of ways you can figure that out. But overall, I would still recommend trying to use something online if you can't afford a personal tutor, especially because that's as close as you can get. We've also moved in the direction of not just a question bank, but how can we create that more personalized feeling? How can we really help you improve your score to increase your chances to get into that? Ultimately, it's not even about the GMAT, it's about getting into a business school that helps you sort of supercharge your career.
But then I love your point about the opportunities to improve the quality of the questions themselves. I used to work at a test prep company that will remain nameless here. I had a great time there, but the story I'm about to tell does not reflect well on them. And this is a very, very long time ago. This is 20 years ago now. So at this company, I taught SAT, GRE, and GMAT, and I used the same questions for all three. That's what the company supplied. So that right there should tell you something. We should not be giving SAT questions to GMAT students or vice versa. Are there commonalities between the exams? Sure, I guess. Enough that most of your examples in that class syllabus should be the same. Not all of them were, but the majority were. That's a horrendous mistake. And I think that part of what's happened. So yes, we understand the GMAT better. We understand testing better in general. Technology enables us to be much better at creating better questions. But I think the other thing that's kind of maybe a second order effect of what's gone on is, now there's a multitude of companies out there. There's more competition. I think that's really, really good for test takers because now you don't have to go to that company that's using SAT questions to teach GMAT. Nobody goes there for GMAT anymore. I'll say that because there are much better options out there. So in that sense, I think it's not that the test has gotten easier, but the opportunities to prep effectively, I think, have gotten so much better over the last decade or two, and there's a lot less of the silliness.
Your point also really alludes to this, that creating content is difficult, and that's why they were reusing questions all across.
Yeah, the single most expensive thing is to write a test question, but also the test companies themselves, or I should say GMAC specifically for the GMAT, has released much more material to study with than when we were first studying for this exam 20 years
That
ago.
is so
So there's a
true.
lot more really high quality material out there to use in terms of actual past test questions. Can I jump on what's in the comment box?
I was just about to go there,
I've been
Stacey.
eyeing that.
So yeah, we've got a nice question from a user, and Abhijit, if you want to toss it on there, fantastic. Is it true that GMAT Online is tougher than in person? Fire away, Stacey.
I've taken it both ways. No, the exam questions, the exam structure, what you're seeing on the exam, everything is the same, whether you take it in a testing center or whether you take it from home or from wherever online. So the test itself is the same. How you take the test could differ, and that could impact your performance. One of the things that we've seen that I didn't really think about before the GMAT Online existed, but makes sense now. When you're taking an exam like this, a high stakes thing like this, you don't want to be too nervous to the point that it's impacting your ability to perform, but you want to have some nerves. If you're totally relaxed, you're probably also not going to perform at your peak. So you want to have some amount of adrenaline coming out while you're taking the test. And what we found for some people, and actually this happened with me when I took the GMAT Online, is that you might be too relaxed taking it at home. For some people, taking it at home is actually not a good thing. It's better to take it in the testing center so that you can maintain that level of, like I said, adrenaline and just focus while taking the exam. Where for other people, taking an exam like this is so stressful that going to the testing center makes it harder for them to perform. And for those people, it's probably better to take the exam in a familiar environment at home or wherever, so that they can bring their anxiety level down to a level that's manageable and actually helpful for taking the exam, as opposed to hindering them while they're taking the exam.
Yes, the one thing I'd add into that is that we end up seeing more issues with test scores getting canceled because of testing irregularities on the at-home GMAT. And it's not because of anything the GMAT's doing policy-wise or anything like that. It's just that, yeah, there are certain requirements for your computer system. If you're running a VPN in the background, you might take your test, they figure it out later, cancel your exam. They might think somebody's lurking behind your computer. They might see you talking to yourself, think you're talking to somebody else. So I think we've all seen plenty of people get their at-home GMAT exams canceled. So just one thing to think about is that can be an extra source of kind of effort and stress to make sure your system's set up.
I will mention GMAC told me that they haven't seen actually different numbers in terms of the number of issues with people taking the test online versus in a testing center. I think it gets written about more.
So Stacey, when was this?
It was probably about 9 months ago, so it could have changed in the past 9 months.
Yeah, I think for me, not the numbers, but I think one of the other conversation that I had with folks at the GMAC was that so it's easier to test on the cheat on the online GMAT than it is in center, and there's this comment that hit me from someone at the GMAC. They said, the person who's going to cheat is most likely the person who cannot ace the test. And that person would be so motivated to cheat that he's going to go to all ends of the earth to figure out how to cheat on the test. So they have to be extra cautious with regards to
Agreed.
Flagging out any irregularity with regards to the online GMAT, because they want to maintain the sanctity of the test. And so I think that kind of because I complained of exactly what Charles said. It's like, why don't you guys have a better support line that addresses complaints and just responds within a day? Because when someone's test gets flagged, it's a few days before they get a response from the GMAC. You've got to do a better job over there. And the guy went on to explain why more tests are being flagged now. Again, in the end, not about irregularities, but tests being flagged overall. So that is going to remain an issue. But I think I'd say just stay calm if it so happens, if you don't hear from the authorities for a few days. As long as you haven't cheated, you should be fine.
The vast majority get resolved. I think it's a source of stress. The vast majority get resolved and there's nothing to see.
Yeah, in 25 years, I've never had somebody who had a flag like that and who didn't do anything wrong. I've never had them actually then have consequences from that.
I actually have had a few.
Did do something wrong that was
different. I know 3 people.
Yeah, I know 2 or 3 as well.
Okay.
Yes.
We tell people, be sure you read the rules. I mean, obviously for the in-person tests as well, but particularly for the online GMAT, we say, listen, make sure you've read the rules very, very, very carefully, because a lot of times we hear about people doing something that was a clear violation of the online test. They didn't realize it,
inadvertently, not trying to.
Totally accidentally, not by design, accidentally. So we say, if you're taking the online GMAT, make sure you really pay close attention to what you have to do, what you can't do.
So I've got a couple of questions coming in. I guess we'll start with a quick myth busting on, and apologies for any mispronunciations of names. Alok's question: has GMAT become tougher than it was 2 years ago? I guess Bevan, haven't heard from you in a little bit. Take that one on real quick, and then
sure,
and then continue on to this one about the exam questions being tougher as well, if you'd like.
Yeah. I mean, in short, I would say no. It feels like a myth to say the GMAT is tougher. And in fact, what we've been talking about is we know the test better. There's actually more opportunities to prep, but it's a stressful test. And I think this is just something to acknowledge, that like sitting in a room for 3+ hours, whether it's at home, but having to follow these rigid set of rules, or driving to an exam center at a specified time, setting your alarm, all of those things can make the exam feel incredibly tough. And this sort of goes back to our official questions representative of the test, which I would say yes. But the challenge is what you can't really replicate is that stress. When it's test day, and I mean, I remember the pit in my stomach years ago, thinking like, oh, am I going to oversleep even if my test is in the afternoon? Is something going to happen? What if I'm sick? And so it's sort of like high level performance that you need to deliver on. It makes, for some people, they thrive and they can sort of thrive in that moment. But for a lot of folks as well, that adds a level of complexity and stress that just makes everything seem harder. Even if you've done official practice tests that are, fairly similar to the actual test. And it can make the test feel harder. And you're like, why is this test so much harder than when I did these practice exams? Why is my score not as good? Well, those things are hard to replicate, and you almost need to train yourself for them. And then for some cases, some students, that might mean taking the test more than once, because the first rep is, okay, I know what this feels like. I know what it feels like to drive to the test center. I know what it feels like to step in that room, and now I'm more prepared. So my perspective, I'm curious to hear what the other panelists think, but my perspective is the GMAT exam isn't necessarily getting tougher, and that the questions, the official questions, are representative of the questions on the GMAT.
Agreed.
Yeah, and to be honest, I think this is probably a wonderful time to be taking the GMAT, as we were talking about at the beginning. If you were taking the test 10, 15 years ago, I mean, it could have been a real struggle. I mean, you have all of the opportunity today. I mean, there's really been like a grand democratization of the test, which I love. Right, for not a lot of money, you can sign up for an online course and have all the stuff you need at your fingertips, literally, to earn a great score. You just got to put in the work. As we spoke about a little while ago, that was absolutely not the case 10 years ago. I mean, 20 years ago, forget it, right? I mean, who knows where the information was out there? I mean, I remember like Googling things 15 years ago, and there was not like almost like a single website you could find that was credible that had information about the test. Today, it's not true. I mean, you have all the opportunities in the world to do well on the GMAT. So as funny as it sounds, I think this is a wonderful time to have to take the test, and you have what you need to do well.
So while we're going on the myth busting of the test is not getting harder, online GMAT is not harder.
I want to add just one point to what Scott
go for
said
it,
to really say, why is it? I think it's a wonderful time, not just because of the resources, but also you have the fewest test takers out there. So if you get a 740, there are fewer 740 scorers or higher competing with you, I think. And when you look at the admission, B schools endowment funds, they are probably at a pretty good level right now, the highest that it has been. So when it comes to scholarships and admissions, that's just, in addition to the test prep piece of it and democratization of that, this fewer test takers means you're more valuable.
And you actually, perfect segue, thank you, Rajat. So what I was about to say is that while we're on this topic of myth busting, tests not getting harder, one of the other things that's come up lately is, has admissions gotten harder? Has the role of GMAT admissions changed? There are rumors floating around that applications are down this cycle. And Stacey, I'd like to go to you on this. So if you can weigh in a little bit, is it getting easier to get into business school because applications are down? Is this true? And is there anything else that's changing in admissions that you think everyone needs to know right now?
There have been a bunch of articles in the past couple of weeks around applications, and a lot of these articles have been saying that that applications are down this year, but actually the articles have gotten it wrong. The stats that have been released lately are for the class of 2024, which is the people who are starting business school right now. So these are the people who were in the admission cycle last year, so from September of last year to maybe March of this year. So just note when you see these articles saying that apps are down this year, the stats are from the last admission cycle. There was a big spike basically the first year of COVID, and then apps came down last year on a year-over-year basis, but really just went back to pre-COVID levels. This year, most schools have just closed their first round, and there aren't really numbers yet to show what's going on this year. So the question is open as to whether there will be more or fewer people, and obviously that also varies school by school in any given year. So just note that question's still open. If you're seeing articles, there was and not to call them out, but they deserve it. Wall Street Journal wrote an article about this and wrote about it as though the numbers were all this year, and it wasn't this year. And now everybody's picking that up and writing about it, and we don't have the numbers yet for this year. So, FYI.
Perfect. Thank you, Stacy. Related question that came up before the session, or somewhat related, about kind of how GMAT exam scores get used. There's always been rumors out there, I think with some grain of truth to them, that GMAT scores, maybe to a lesser degree GRE scores, get used in post-MBA career or hiring decisions. So we hear all the time, oh, I need to get, I've already gotten into my target business school, but I need to get a really high GMAT score because I want to go into investment banking or private equity or consulting. So what have the four of you seen in terms of whether there's any truth to that at all? So do you have students, former students, who find that their GMAT scores make a difference in their employment outcomes? Or does that seem to be a myth from what you're seeing?
I have had multiple students for whom it's made a difference, specifically for banking and consulting and for like the top or name brand firms. Yes.
And has that changed at all over the last, let's say, decade or so?
There may be some differences in the past couple of years just because of what's been going on with the pandemic. I'm still not sure. But other than that, no, it's those kinds of firms. I think it's silly, frankly. You've been through business school. They should be, if they're concerned about that, they should just be looking at your grades from business school. The GMAT is silly for these firms to use, but a lot of them, again, like the name brand ones, they're getting so many people coming in. I think it's one easy way that they're using to sort through applications. I don't think it's a good thing, but it's happening. Yeah.
Yeah, we've seen it a lot too. Maybe more so in recent years. As Stacy said, banks, consultancies, top name firms, asking about IR scores, asking about GMAT scores. So yes, as Stacy said, it's probably just another way to sort of get a read on someone's intellectual capacity or some other, their hard work, their work ethic, just another data point in the mix.
And I'd say, and Stacy mentioned it, I think it's industry specific. And so, for a large majority of students who aren't going into, say, banking, especially, I've seen it a little more in banking than consulting, depending on the kind of consulting. I haven't seen the scores used outside of those industries. So if you're talking about like real estate, tech, marketing, and other functions. And so just calling out that, like, as you, a student, are thinking about, whether or not to take the GMAT, how it impacts your chances for admissions, it really should be all part of a broader career plan. And I say that as someone who, when I went to business school, didn't have a broader career plan. So I should take some of my own advice. But as you think about where do I want to end up, you can actually think about, okay, if it is in banking, maybe the GMAT is critical, right? Not just for application, but potentially for your post-MBA career. But if you're thinking about tech, not at all, right? And so I think it's important for everyone to sort of take this information and think about how it applies to them.
And you reminded me of something I wanted to say earlier. If you do take the GMAT, the GRE, whatever you take, you don't have to show it to the schools if you don't like your score. And in fact, most people are applying to a range of schools, and you might give your scores to some of those schools and not to all of them, depending on that school's averages and that sort of thing. So you really do have a lot more flexibility now too. It used to be 10 plus years ago that a lot of schools would say, if you take it, you must tell us your scores, and nobody's saying that anymore.
So I want to talk about a personal experience in that context. Just I mean, I agree. There are certain industries that require, but even outside those industries, in some ways, it plays a factor. So this is 2007. I was looking I was working for Honeywell, looking for a job change within Honeywell, and the person who interviewed me was an ex-McKinsey consultant. And one of the things, and that guy obviously had a GMAT score, and so when I walked into the interview, the guy talked about my GMAT score, and I think that so even though it was not a consulting position, a classical mid-tier management position, you get, I think, for 5 minutes you get some respect walking into that interview room when you go there, and that does give you a slight edge overall. Was it required that I have a GMAT score? No. But does it give you an edge even in other industries? If your hiring manager has a GMAT score, I think there is that level of familiarity and that evaluation of aptitude that automatically happens once you have that.
So, another question that's popping up here about kind of not a change in the test itself, but this viewer can see from different ESRs that the mean score of GMAT exams is slowly increasing. So is that true from what you've seen? And if so, what do you think is going on there? Should that change the way people prep? Why are scores going up? And if they are, what do you think that students should do about it?
I think that's a demographic change, right? I mean, think about it this way.
That's the only way, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, when I took the GMAT, 700 was 95th percentile. Now it's 89th percentile. It's a demographic change, and more international students are taking the test. They do better on quant. Of course, the mean's going to go up. The verbal side numbers have remained more or less the same. Quant side, they're significantly skewed towards the higher side, and of course the means would go up. Again, and that's the same thing is reflected when you think about the median scores that these schools talk about. I mean, what is it, 727, 730 at Booth right now, and what it was about 6 years ago, it was 710 or so. So it's just shifting towards the higher range because of the kind of people who are taking the test.
And then
there's inflation everywhere.
There's inflation everywhere, yeah.
And then you add in the test waivers and the
test
GRE
waiver thing, right? Yeah, and with everything going on the past couple of years, you've had a lot of people who, you're going to self-select out if you don't think you can get that high score. If you still think you can get that high score, you're going to take it. So
yeah.
While we're talking about other tests, we have another question about does the difficulty level of the executive assessment, is that the same as that of the GMAT? And this is kind of a fun one. So for those of you who don't know, EA is the executive assessment. It is created by GMAT. It's shorter, so it's an hour and a half long, 30 minutes of integrated reasoning, 30 minutes of verbal, 30 minutes of quant. It was designed originally for EMBA programs. Now it's being used more and more in admissions, at least as an option for conventional full-time programs. So we're running into more and more students who are saying, oh, maybe the EA is an option. So for a lot of full-time programs now, you can take the GMAT, the GRE, or the EA. So is the difficulty level of the EA the same as the GMAT?
If you have the option to take the EA, take the EA.
Yeah, for sure.
And say more about why, because the questions, so it's the same kinds of questions,
so
right?
Same kinds of questions. And in fact, in one way, you can consider it harder because your integrated reasoning score goes into your total score, where the integrated reasoning is stripped out on the GMAT. So there are a couple of things here. Because of the way that the EA is built, it is shorter. It's also panel adaptive rather than question adaptive. So within a small group of questions, you can move around. You don't have the same ratcheting up of the difficulty level as you do on a question adaptive exam, so that feels easier, and the chance that you can do a question and come back to it feels just mentally better to a lot of people. And then the other thing has to do with the inflation comment, Scott's inflation comment, and I call it the arms race. So GMAT scores keep going up and up and up because the schools are looking for the rankings, that whole thing. It's a crazy system. And then as people self-selected out to the GRE, that left just the higher scorers getting into these schools on their GMAT scores. And so you got an arms race with GMAT scores increasing. And that was part of the reason why the GRE took off so much when it was first accepted for business school. Now the same thing is happening with the GRE now that it's a mainstream offering as well. But for the EA, that hasn't happened yet. And the EA is actually being used by most schools in the way that standardized tests should be used, which is as a threshold indicator or level, meaning if you can hit a certain score, as long as you're above that score, we don't care how much above that score you are. But as long as you can get to a certain score, we know you have the skills that you need to succeed in business school, and you're fine. For executive MBA programs, that threshold on the EA is typically about a 150, and for regular MBA programs, it's typically about a 155. And so you don't have that same inflationary pressure to like, I must get higher and higher than everybody else. And I really wish that I almost kind of want GMAT to go to, I don't know, some kind of a pass-fail system, even though that can't happen, but something like that where schools just say, okay, look, if you get X score for our school, you're good. We're going to strip that number out of the application. We don't care how much higher you are, and we're not even going to look at that. We're just going to look at the rest of your application. That's what should be happening. So the EA is getting closer to that, and the exam itself feels easier to take. So yeah, if you can take the EA, take it.
And that was the original design of the EA, Stacy, is that the intention was, hey, we're going to, schools are going to decide on bands. So we feel confident in your ability to succeed in this coursework if you're within this range on the EA. And they haven't published those publicly, or at least for the most part, they haven't. And maybe they have in the last couple of months. But
they haven't published the percentiles publicly. Those have leaked out because some schools have in their application process have then, once you put your score in, they tell you the percentile. So people start sharing that. But officially, the percentiles have not been published.
And those bands that were originally part of the design of the EA, hey, we're going to sit down, GMAC sat down with schools and said, hey, let's kind of make this something where we can kind of treat it that way. The original intent of these tests is we want one more data point that says, will you be comfortable in this coursework? So they created bands. They have, to my knowledge, they still haven't published them. This was as of maybe a few months ago when I spoke to somebody at GMAC. I hope they don't, because I think it's a really good thing to say, hey, we want you to be somewhere in this range. It's going to tell us that you're going to be okay. I don't want an arms race to happen with the EA. And I realize that it's good for all of our businesses that we have this crazy GMAT arms race. But I don't think it's good for test takers.
It's out of control.
It's totally out of control.
Great. And just interjecting, and I think Stacey sort of made a great point about how standardized tests should be used. And this goes back to like, how is the GMAT used in admissions and how should it be used? Because it's just one part. People have work experience, careers, you have your story, you have how this is going to sort of catapult you, and then the GMAT is one part. And I think what happens is with these rankings, the average score for different schools is a factor into these business school rankings, which in reality, we can argue about what rankings actually mean and how they impact students at the end of the day. But there's almost a pride to having a higher average GMAT score or be sort of in your admitted class. And so that idea of bringing that down as more of a pass-fail and thinking more holistically is challenging, because the systems and the incentives set up around for these directors of admissions is one, like, how can our school rank better? What are the factors that go into these third-party rankings versus how do we sort of get the class that's most representative of the class we want to have? And that is, I think, part of the reason that sort of some folks recommend, say, going test optional or to the GRE, doing a GMAT waiver or whatnot, because then those aren't factored into the rankings as much. So there's almost more latitude from the conversations I've had with directors of admissions. We have more latitude to look at the whole holistic admissions sort of story of an individual, because we know that like a low GMAT score won't impact our rankings. And so this is sort of some behind the scenes stuff that I think does matter, and incentives matter. And so I appreciate the comment about the EA and how standardized tests should be used, and the idea of pass-fail, which to me sort of resonates at a level of like, what are we trying to do? Ultimately, it's not get the highest GMAT score, but it's show that you can succeed in an MBA program, show that you can learn the skills you need for your career. And this is just a step in that process.
So let's cover one more admissions-related question here, and then we'll get into we've got a few questions here about differences between practice tests and actual exams, so we'll get to that afterwards. So KP's question here, are the IR and AWA sections extremely critical for top B schools in their decision-making process for applicants? So how much do those matter, and how do you guys approach those with students? Scott, I haven't heard your voice in a while, so go ahead and fire away on this one.
Yeah, that's a great question regarding the IR and AWA. The practical advice I give people is, look, if you're applying to a top school, I mean, why even have the chance of the low IR or low AWA ruin your prospects? And it's just not worth it. I mean, if you're preparing for the quant section, the verbal section, I mean, you're already teed up to do well on both AWA and IR. Obviously, there are specific animals, a little bit different, but you're already going to have some skills in place, right? Particularly in IR. Like, why would you not just put in whatever. I mean, look, in a day, you could probably work yourself up to a top AWA score if you really wanted to, right? Couple weeks of IR practice. Like we usually have the IR practice. Students do the IR towards the end. We want to be sure they get through their core quant and verbal skills and knowledge before. But as a practical matter, like why not? Right. I mean, wouldn't that stink if you had a 740 and like a super low IR and AWA? And I don't know, I sometimes tell people, and this is just my own sort of sensibilities, like you have to think like, what is the person across from you thinking? Like, I don't know, like maybe an admissions person would question the judgment of a person who would submit, a very, very low IR or AWA score, right? They'd say, is that the best policy, right? Probably not, I would say. So my advice to students is always like, look, do your best. Now, look, if it's coming down to it, if, you got to get your applications in, if you don't want to retake the GMAT, if you have a great score and it's just you have mediocre IR and AWA, I guess you could be okay. I think it's a heck of a lot better to have a high quant and a high verbal, right, than the converse, right? But I think when it comes down to it, if you can, a couple extra weeks for IR and AWA, right? It's funny, we were talking about the use of the GMAT post MBA, and I was speaking with some hiring managers at consultancies who are TTP alum, and I said, hey, what's up with the IR? Why are you guys so interested in the IR? And it's kind of, they're like, well, what do we do? Like we give people like a haystack of data, and we're like, hey, find the needle, right? That's what the consultants are doing in most cases on a day-to-day basis. So, one of the ladies and gentlemen just said the IR just gives us a little more sort of certainty that someone's able to sort of sift through real world data and stuff. So is it the end of the world if you don't have a high IR, AWA? Probably not. Is it better if you do? Yeah, it is.
So for me personally, if you have a bad AWA score, it's a big red flag, because think about it this way, B school admission officers are going to read your AWA and they're going to read your application. And if your sentence construction's off in your AWA and your application's flawless, it's clear that you haven't written that application. You've not had a major role in writing that, and that could really jeopardize your chances of admission. So AWA, absolutely, 5.5, you've got to do that. And like Scott said, it takes about a day to do it. If you're really good in CR, it's primarily about just building those arguments and just hashing it out. The IR piece, for me, I think 6.0 or higher. Again, same thing. It doesn't take very long if you've done with quant and verbal. Like Scott, we also recommend that people do IR post studying for quant and verbal, and it shouldn't take that long, frankly. Why would you want to leave anything to chance if you've worked so hard for the GMAT?
I smile because I agree, right? Why would you leave anything to chance, right? Why not take the extra time? And my personal story, which I think is helpful to share, and I want to say just the story and don't do what I did. So this was back when online test prep wasn't really as widely available, and I was using books and I was writing. I didn't actually practice the essay, the AWA. I should have, I didn't. So I went in and I felt really good about my quant and verbal section. I was doing AWA at the end, and I did finish one of the essays, and I got a 3.5. So Rajat, you wouldn't have hired me, but I got a 3.5, and I had a pretty good GMAT score. And so I was like, oh, do I cancel or not? But I just went for it, and luckily I was admitted into some top schools, ended up going to Haas. And I say that as just one point. There's no reason not to prep for it. I would not recommend doing what I did. At the same time, I do think sometimes folks can't show grace, and I'd have strong personal statements, strong stories, strong GMAT score. And so I do think, there are things that matter more than other things. At the same time, I would agree with Scott and Rajat and say that, take the little bit of extra time and prep for it. But in a time-constrained world, make sure you're also leaning heavily into the things that are going to matter the most.
Perfect. Thank you. Let's get into this question about everyone keeps saying that quant on the official GMAT mocks is of significantly lower difficulty than the actual GMAT. Is there any truth to this? I think I might add to that question for, we'll pick on Stacy next with this one. How much of that is the actual difficulty of the questions being different, and how much of it is that, hey, when the 5 of us and our companies were out creating materials, we got to base them on something. So we're going to be inspired by the official tests among many other resources. So how much of it is that maybe we're helping students along, they see questions that look like those official practice test questions, and then they get to the actual test and it's jarring. How much of it is the difficulty itself?
Yeah, and I'm going to make a distinction here between the official practice tests from GMAC and practice tests that we've all made ourselves. For the official GMAC practice tests, for the most part, they are very close to the real thing. But my personal experience there has been that the higher you are scoring, the less hard they feel. And my guess is that the pool of questions in the database for the official practice tests, my guess is that pool of questions is not as deep at the very highest levels as it is for the actual official test. And so if you're scoring 730 plus, yeah, the official practice tests are probably going to feel easier to you. For company practice tests, I'll speak for my own company, but my guess is that this is probably true for most, if not all, companies. My goal in creating our practice tests is not to give you something that's exactly like the official test. It's to give you something that's a little bit harder than the official test, because the last thing that I want to have happen is for you to go into the official test and have that feel harder than what you've been practicing. If anything, I want the official test to feel just a little bit easier than what you've been practicing. And so on our practice tests, we're overshooting a little bit on purpose, because we're trying to train you hard before you get in there for the real test. And my guess would be that that's true also for everybody else in the room.
Yeah, completely. And we sometimes see when people say, hey, the real test felt significantly harder than the mocks. A reasonable amount of time, those times, there's things that went on in the student's sort of test prep that maybe contributed to that. So for example, they only took 2 practice tests or 1 practice test. And that's a huge mistake, because, as everyone has alluded to already, I mean, there's something real about going in to take the test, whether you're in your office, at home, online, you're going into the test center. You have to get your brain and your body ready to sit there and think, and, not check your iPhone and not go get a drink of Diet Coke or whatever we all do when our brains are like, ooh, this is a little bit too hot and heavy. Like you take a little break or you check the Wall Street Journal, but you can't do that, right? And you have to prepare for that. And, the more of the official practice tests you take, the more practice tests you take in general, the better prepared you're going to be. So that's one way to not have the real test be like, surprise, right? I'm harder. That's a big one. And, other than that, like really replicating test day conditions when you take those practice tests. And, if you asked me 10 years ago, like how much replicating the practice test conditions mattered, I would have said, yeah, it matters pretty much. But now I'd say 100%. Like you got to do exactly what you have to do. Like you want to be practicing exactly how you're going to play the game. And it really does matter. So really making sure that you're not doing anything you couldn't do on the real test, and you're doing everything in the practice test that you should be doing in the real test. I mean, believe it or not, from time to time, we'll see people on like the forum say, I used the calculator. And you were surprised that,
or they paused the test.
Yeah, I paused the time. Yeah, I went out and got lunch.
No.
Yeah. So I think we face this issue, and this is a nuisance, because people who don't perform as well on the real test are the ones who make the most noise. And so internally, we kind of created a metric which we call as a student's consistency metric across subsections. So in consistency metric in SC, CR, RC, and what you're really looking at is plotting the last 15 hard trend for various question types. And what we found, and this is not just practice, it's just any practice that they do on the platform 10, 15 days before the exam. And students who were consistent across it, they scored very similar to what they were getting on the official test, on our mocks, on the GMAT. People who had dips over there, which again is an indication of the behaviors that you guys are talking about, they are the ones who actually showed a significant amount of variation between what they actually got on the GMAT versus what they were scoring on their mocks, some of their mocks. And again, people who really say this, they talk one of the other things that we found was those guys typically highlight the mocks they did well on. They also don't mention the mocks they don't do well on. And I think so that's kind of where for us that consistency metric, coding that on the platform was a huge win, because we could literally predict and warn
I like
people.
that. That's really cool. Yeah, and the other thing, of course, as we talked about earlier, is the real test counts and the practice tests don't count, and that messes with your brain when you're taking the test. It messes with your ability, and it changes the decisions that you make. People who have, this is one of the things I watch out for when I'm looking at practice tests and then see somebody have a big drop on a real test. They'll have what I'll call minor timing and decision-making issues on the test. They have a few questions where they went too long, but then on the real test, suddenly they're going way too long, or they have a lot more questions on which they're hanging on because now they know it counts. So your bad habits can
You're
get
going towards the first 10, first 20, and it's like, I'm not going to let go of that question.
Yeah, and so your
but
bad
I
habits
did let go of it in the actual mock test. Yes.
Yeah. So just watch out for that too. If someone saw a big score drop, chances are there's some combination of time management issues, anxiety, performance management issues, and then that's factoring into your decision making and your ability to focus and concentrate. And that's what's really leading to the drop in performance on test day.
Let's grab one last audience question before we wrap up in about 4 minutes here. So from Anuj, again, apologies for any mispronunciations. Do you think GMAT is giving more experimental questions on the test? And I think we might all know off the top of our heads exactly how many experimental questions there are. One of the joys of the ESRs, I think we know that answer. Kind of interesting here, though. I got two unusual questions in CR, syllogism, and more meaning-based questions in sentence correction. Meaning-based questions are just part of the exam. I think almost every sentence correction question is meaning-based on some level. What's the point of grammar and usage? It's so that you can convey that meaning more clearly and elegantly. So there's always going to be meaning-based questions. Those are not necessarily experimental. I guess I'll pick on whoever would like to go and talk about how many experimental questions are on the test. It's a small number. You shouldn't worry about them. Bhavin, do you want to fire away on this?
I was going to defer to one of the other.
I'll just say they do not change. We all get the same number of experimental questions versus counted questions. They do not change that.
And it's
we all have the same experience for that.
6 verbal, 3 quant, and it's all the same for everybody. Do not try to predict which ones they are.
Yeah,
don't. I would say the number has gone down as the test became shorter.
Oh yeah. Sorry,
Yeah.
But for all of us taking the same
for
test
all of
now,
us, it's
it
the
doesn't
same,
vary
yes.
from person to person.
yeah, only for the folks who took it before 2018.
Yeah. Yes. That's the only change. And I think the thing which is the GMAC, they have to refresh their question pool every 14 to 15 days when you can retake the test. And
Exactly.
And so they have to fill in, and as they replace it with, the experimental questions are a means for them to evaluate the testing items for future tests or so. So we've got to have those experimental questions and that count. So I was talking to 2 students who took the test within a week apart, got a very similar verbal score, and both of them really they were friends, incidentally, and both of them got the same RC passes, though at different times on the test. And so again, just to show that questions repeat across the same 15-day span, but I think once every 15-day span they refresh, so you've got to have those experimental questions out there.
Yeah, I'm still surprised at how many people actually think there would be able to figure out what was an experimental question. And
No chance.
Right. You have no
part
idea.
of this panel is to help students, of course, do better on the test. So yeah, that's definitely worth reemphasizing Charles's point that do not try and predict what's experimental, what's not. There's no way to tell.
Or which question is easy and which question is hard.
Of course. You have no idea.
Why?
Of course, yeah.
We've been doing this for 20 years. We can't tell. So you're not going to be able to tell either.
Exactly.
You use your brain energy for the things you can control, which is getting the questions right. Who cares if it's easy or hard? You'll get your score soon enough.
I think that's the perfect final word, Scott. Appreciate that. All right, running out of time here. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. Thank you so much to the panelists, Rajat, Bhavin, Scott, Stacy. Absolutely wonderful to get the joy of being on a panel with all 4 of you. Finally, seen your
Likewise.
names for years and years. So
Yes,
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Live crowd. Still plenty of MBA Spotlight to come, and study plan unveiling tomorrow, same time. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Have a great day, everybody.